For many people, in July 1914, the First World War seemed to have come out of nowhere. But in fact, from the 1870s onwards, there seemed to have been certain conditions that were put in place that made war possible. The spark, and often cited as being the cause of the First World War, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to Austria-Hungary, in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. But in reality, the conditions to make war possible had been building up since the 1870s. These ideologies were imperialism, militarism, and nationalism, and what made the war possible was the result of industrialization. In fact, by 1900, most of Europe had become industrialized. It began in Britain, then through Belgium, France in the Napoleonic Wars, and after 1870, Germany concentrated on chemical and steel production, took a leading role, and by 1900 it was one of the largest economies in Europe. Russia, on the other hand, took a much longer time to get involved in the industrialization process and didn't have an established railroad network in 1914, and this would lead it to difficulties during the First World War because it couldn't get weapons or food to the front line quick enough. Imperialism is the second ideology that was very important. Here you have Queen Victoria carving up the cake of China along with Wilhelm II of Germany. You can see also Britain's influence in Africa. You can see here all the pink colours, Britain's influence around the world, in Australia, India, Canada. You can see France's influence around the world. These imperial families were also interconnected. We have Franz Joseph here, Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. He had fewer children and less connections, but these guys, King George V of England, Nicholas II of Russia, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, and Leopold, King of the Belgians, were all connected through this one person, Queen Victoria of England. She was the niece of Leopold I, and her husband was Leopold's nephew. Now, she had 9 children who married into all the royal families of Europe, meaning that Wilhelm and George were cousins. Nicholas and George were cousins. Nicholas and Wilhelm were third cousins. In fact, these two guys were both great-grandsons of Paul I of Russia. They had both descended from Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, and Wilhelm was a first cousin of Nicholas's wife, Alix of Hesse. And Alix of Hesse was Victoria's 26th grandchild, and Wilhelm was Queen Victoria's eldest grandson. Militarism, second ideology, extremely important to Wilhelm II, who wanted to prove the power of Germany. He wanted to expand the empire, and he was at the same time afraid of being encircled by France, Britain, and Russia. His determination to dominate caused the other nations to fear his domination and, in turn, to engage in an arms race, which was fueled by the emerging technologies in industrial production of the Industrial Revolution. And they were determined to overcome the difficulties they had met in the American Civil War, the Crimean War, the Boer War, the Russo-Japanese War, and they wanted to improve their weapons. Here we have the Big Bertha, very famous for destroying the Fort Lansin in Liège. We have explosive shells, the British Lee Enfield, machine guns, barbed wire, which was used extensively both to protect, to defend, and to trap. Very significant in the relationship between Germany and Britain was the arrival of the Dreadnought. In 1906, Britain launched a new warship called the Dreadnought. German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm immediately said that he would build 4 of these dreadnoughts, which led the British to build 14 of them. The third ideology is nationalism. 2 types of nationalism. There are those countries who want to prove their dominance and who are already dominant, Germany, Britain, Russia, France, and Italy. and those who are subjugated and want to be free of their dominating rulers, i.e. the Balkan countries and specifically Serbia. Very briefly, Germany, a young country unified in 1871, had quickly become the strongest economic and military power in Europe. By 1890, it was trying to extend its influence around the world, which upset the British slightly, who were afraid for their global empire. Italy, a very young country unified in 1870, was also looking to extend its territory into northern Africa, which caused it to have problems with France, who equally wanted to have territory in northern Africa. At the same time, Italy wanted to have to extend its territory in the north, which was an area which was at this time occupied by Austria-Hungary. France had big issues with newcomers. It had been the dominant power in Europe for centuries, and it had just lost in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War the two provinces Alsace and Lorraine, and in addition it had had to pay huge indemnities to Germany for its role in the Franco-Prussian War. This could be important when we look at the Treaty of Versailles. Britain had been the leader of the Industrial Revolution. It was, in 1870, the most industrially advanced country in Europe, and it had a huge empire. Britain was an island, is an island nation, and was very proud of its reputation as the ruler on the seas. It needed the seas to reach the parts of its empire and to trade overseas. Before 1890, Britain's main concerns had been France and Russia, but as Germany grew, Germany became its number one worry, let's say. For Austria-Hungary, the priorities were very different. They had to manage the pan-Slavic nationalism that was growing among their peoples, particularly Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, Romanians and Poles, who all wanted political independence. Their reaction was to try to suppress all nationalistic movements in and outside of the empire. This led them into difficulty with Russia, who 2/3 of its people are Slavic, and for Russia it was very easy to claim that it was protecting other Slavic nations, when in reality Russia is the largest country in Europe with at this time the largest population, but the territory occupied was not very habitable. It's very cold, it's not really useful for agriculture, so in 1870 Russia wanted access to warm water ports in the Balkan countries, leading to tensions with Austria-Hungary and Britain over the access to the Mediterranean Sea. Finally, we have Serbia, who is the dominated peoples who want to have their freedom. Pan-Slavism had existed for a long time, but in fact it was the Serbs who were the first to rebel against both Austria-Hungary and the slowly dying Ottoman Empire. It all came to a head in June 1914 when Franz Ferdinand decided to go to Bosnia and Herzegovina to inspect the imperial armed forces. Bosnia and Herzegovina had been annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, and the Serbian nationalists were angry about this. In fact, it was a 19-year-old, Gavrilo Princip, who shot the royal company dead, and this was the event that set off the chain of events that led Austria-Hungary into the First World War. Austria-Hungary immediately blamed the Serbian government for the attack and declared war on Serbia. So here's the question. How did this war between Serbia and Austria-Hungary turn into the deadly conflict of the First World War, in which an estimated 20 million people died? Remember, starting blocks: the progress of industrialization, nationalism, militarism, and imperialism.